In 1981, Noam Chomsky sat down with KPFA Berkeley host Phillip Maldari to make sense of the Camp David peace accords signed by Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel and witnessed by President Jimmy Carter.
In January 1976, the Arab states, including the confrontation states, including Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia and Syria, and in fact even the PLO, came to the Security Council of the United Nations with a proposal which again called for a comprehensive settlement on the June 67 borders with recognized borders and demilitarized zones and the rest of it, and that was again at this time was vetoed by the United States. This went on for several years. By 1977, Sadat was becoming desperate. And he then made this dramatic trip to Jerusalem, which was impossible to suppress. I mean, the February 71 offer was effectively suppressed. That was quiet diplomacy. But the trip to Jerusalem was just too dramatic. And in fact, it apparently took the United States by surprise. Now it was Carter, not Kissinger. And the United States essentially went along with it and tried to take it over. And tried to utilize it as a way of achieving what is one of the main purposes of the United States in the region, and that is to prevent Europe from playing any role in coordinating affairs in the Middle East. So that became Camp David.
Of course, also preventing the Soviet Union.
Well, that's what they talk about, but they really don't care. I mean, that's propaganda cover. Nobody expects the Soviet Union to play a major role in areas of prime concern to the United States. They know if the Soviet Union's been very cautious not to interfere in regions which it knows to be at the core of American interest, like the Middle East, because they know that there'd be a nuclear war if they did.
Let's go back to Camp David. Camp David not only provided for the return of the Sinai to Egypt, it also provided for autonomy negotiations for the Palestinians of Gaza and the West Bank.
Well, that's just a cover for ensuring that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip stay within Israeli control. And in this respect, Camp David was an extension of the Kissinger diplomacy.
Did Sadat basically agree with the notion that the West Bank and Gaza should remain under nominal Israeli control?
Sadat was intelligent enough to realize that his interests, and in fact the interests of elite groups throughout the Arab world, would be best served by suppressing radical nationalism. And the main sort of what inflames radical nationalism in the Middle East, in the Arab countries, is the Palestinian problem. So Sadat, like the Saudi Arabians and other conservative groups that want to be American clients, like them, he assumed that the best solution would be to constrain the Palestinians in some mini-state which would be basically controlled by a Jordanian-Israeli military alliance and supported by the most conservative, in fact, deeply reactionary forces in the Arab world, like Saudi Arabia. That's what Sadat regarded, I suspect, as the best solution from the point of view of the ruling elites in the Arab states. And most of the world agrees, incidentally, but the United States and Israel object, and the autonomy provisions of the Camp David Accord are just a very transparent fig leaf intended primarily for American public opinion, which it was obvious at the time would have exactly the effect that now everybody can see they have had, namely just to lay the basis for further steps towards Israeli annexation. This was quite obvious at the time, but people who said it were, of course, dismissed and attacked in the usual fashion. Now I don't think any rational person can deny it. It's just obvious that that's what it's leading towards. In fact, it's even reached the point where, to my astonishment, a leading Israeli military historian, Amos Perlmutter, who's very hawkish himself, incidentally, had an article in the New York Times a couple of days ago in which he stated that General Sharon, the defense minister, who's really in many ways the leading figure in Israel, that he stated, Perlmutter, that Sharon, his plan is to simply expel the Arabs out of the occupied territories.
Let's go and talk about the West Bank for a while. Under the Labor government, there were elections in the West Bank and Gaza in which mayors were elected, and in every case, candidates sympathetic with the PLO were elected in those elections. Since then, those mayors have become the only official representatives of the Palestinian people under Israeli occupation, and they have been a center for opposition to Israeli occupation. Most recently, the Israeli occupiers have put out of office several of the Palestinian mayors and have attempted to set up what are called village leagues, which would work more closely with a civilian leadership in the occupied area under Professor Menachem Milson. What is really happening here?
Well, first of all, we should recognize the significance of the change from military to civilian control. There is a significance, but I think one should be aware of what it is. Milson himself, for example, I think is a reserve colonel in the Army. And the shift from military to civilian control simply means a shift towards annexation, just as it did in the Golan Heights. What we correctly call the virtual annexation of the Golan Heights, in effect, was a switch from military to civilian, a military to a civilian legal structure. That's the device that's used to take the next step towards annexation. So the Likud policy, the policy that you're describing, that's associated with Milson and Sharon, of extending civilian rule over the West Bank, while that has a sort of a benign sound to it, after all, we'd prefer civilian rule to military rule. In effect, that's quite the opposite. What it means is it's a step towards actual annexation. And the next thing after civilian rule is further integration, and the ultimate result of that is outright annexation. It's clear that that's what Likud is drifting towards. Now, the Labour Party program was quite different. I would argue more cynical, but at least different. The Labour Party position associated with Moshe Dayan, and actually it's called the Alon Plan, named after Yigal Alon, who was the foreign minister at one time, that this plan was for Israel to essentially take what it wanted in the occupied territories. So to take the Jordan Valley and a substantial area around Jerusalem and the water and agricultural resources, just essentially to take what it needed, but to not take over the areas of heavy population concentration. And the reason was, and the people who lived in the population, at least the heavy concentrated population, they would either be left, they would be, if they wanted, if Jordan would agree, they could become Jordanian citizens under Israeli military control, or else they'd simply be left stateless, which is the worst possible position for a human being in a world of nation states. That means no protection against any arbitrary act of state power. That was the Labour Party position, and the reason for it was that they're concerned with what they call, somewhat euphemistically, the demographic problem. Namely, under the Begin plan, under the plan which is plainly going towards annexation, there'll be a very substantial Arab population in the Jewish state. By the year 2000, it might be, say, half. And the question is, what happens then? Well, what happens is you just become like South Africa. I mean, already the Arab population in the Jewish state is necessarily second-class citizens, but within the borders of Israel, it's like 15%. If in an expanded Israel, it'll pretty soon be something like 50%. And the mechanisms that are used to deprive them of the primary rights of citizenship, while they can easily be disguised, or readily easily disguised when it's a small minority, that'll be extremely difficult as they're a larger part of the population. Now, the people they have to disguise them from are primarily American public opinion. That's the important thing. And that'll become harder and harder. The Labour Party realized that. They're much more attuned to American public opinion and the need to propagandize effectively than the Likud is, and for that reason they wanted to exclude the areas of heavy population concentration and to essentially leave them to their own devices. That's why they had the election.